People who buy old houses tend to value them partly for their look and feel and partly for their history. The history has several components. Things that happen to the house, additions, remodelings, fires, floods, and so on. Things that happened in the house, births, deaths, weddings, businesses, all kinds of events. But not least of all, things that happen to people associated with the house, even though most of those things probably happened somewhere else. If you go to a B&B in Pennsylvania and it advertises George Washington slept here, your interest is not so much in how he slept as in the other things he did when he was awake. Learning about your house's history can be quite an adventure, but it can take you pretty far afield, and sometimes you find the history is not what you thought. My house on Cape Cod is a perfect example. Fortunately, those of us who live here on the Cape have some great resources to help us find out the truth. Our house at the corner of Rendezvous Lane is like many on Route 6A, a 200-year-old former tavern once owned by a family named Crocker. Back in colonial days, it was one of 5 taverns in the neighborhood, serving people who had business at the old courthouse. It even has a plaque on the corner identifying it as the Henry Crocker House. But of course, that doesn't really tell us much about Henry Crocker himself. Here's a view of the house from across the street, sometime in the early 20th century. It was after 1905, when the front wing was added to the former courthouse, which in the meantime had become a Baptist church and needed a parish hall. You can just see it between the trees in the middle of the photo. But it was before the original and very picturesque St. Mary's Church was enlarged to its later dimensions. As for the house itself, the dormers and side porch are pretty much as they appear today. Here's a slightly earlier view, looking north on Rendezvous Lane, next to the house. It's on a postcard with a postmark in 1903. The woman in white is probably Isabella Sprague, great-grandmother of our neighbor, Jim Calvin. Notice the farm vehicle heading up the road toward the water. Also, no dormer on the 3rd floor, and a neatly trimmed hedge in front of the house. This picture is probably from the late 1880s. No porch on the left, no dormers on the 3rd floor, no hedge on the right side, just some scruffy bushes. But there is a small porch or portico over the front door that's no longer there today. This photo came with the house when we bought it in 2002. But there was no documentation, which is too bad because there are people in the picture. If we'd known who they were, we could have learned a lot more. There's not much more detail when you zoom in, but clearly it's a man with a white beard and 2 women, perhaps his daughters or granddaughters. Who were these people? Certainly not Henry Crocker. I did a little digging about Henry and found he'd left town around 1850 while still in his 40s. It also turned out that while Henry's name is on the plaque, he'd actually left the house in foreclosure. It seems he didn't care for the tavern business. After inheriting it from his family, he repeatedly tried to sell it. When that failed, he took out a mortgage, auctioned off the furniture, and rented the property to a dentist, who later bought it from the mortgage holder following the foreclosure. My first clue about who the people in the photo really were came in 2005 when I was out in the driveway getting the paper and a man named Bill Coyle stopped by. He told me his grandfather had bought the house in the 1920s, and it had been in the family until the 70s. But it had also been in the family once before, when his grandfather's grandfather had bought it back in the 1880s. Unfortunately, it wasn't until after he left that I remembered this photo. But it did get me wondering, could this white-bearded man have been Bill Coyle's great-great-grandfather? Bill also left me with another piece of history concerning the space behind the little panel door under the front stairs. Squeeze through the door, and it opens into a sizable chimney chase, with enough room for several people to stand up in. Rumor had it the space had been used as a hiding place on the Underground Railroad. And as a young boy exploring the house in the 1920s, Bill's father had confirmed it when he discovered a bucket of Confederate money stashed next to the chimney. That's pretty much where my sense of house history stood for the next several years. With Barnstable House next to us on the other side, rumored to have had as many as 11 ghosts, we were inevitably on the route for the local ghost tour. And for a while, my wife had an employee working out back in the barn who was convinced that we had ghosts too. So the past continued to have a way of rearing its head from time to time. Then in 2013, we had a new opportunity when the National Geographic TV channel came to Barnstable Village to shoot an episode of its archaeology show, Diggers. If you don't know Diggers, it's like a cross between Antiques Roadshow and Car Talk. Two funky guys with metal detectors looking for buried treasure. Our house, the courthouse, and the Sturgis Library, 2 buildings over, were all selected as shooting sites for the Diggers show. Here's one of the diggers at work in our side yard. Here he is again at the moment of discovery, or possibly a reenactment of the moment of discovery, as he pulls up a pre-revolutionary coin. Unfortunately, when I tried to clean the dirt off the coin, it fell apart. But they did find some other interesting stuff. This hubcap from a Model T Ford was just a few inches below the surface, next to Anne's vegetable garden. They also found this strange-looking item about 5 inches across that still showed traces of brightly colored paint. Lucy Loomis of Barnstable Sturgis Library gets the credit for identifying it. It was a bracket used in 19th century flower arrangements. And they found this little bronze sleigh, about 6 inches long, surprisingly heavy, very nicely detailed, a great souvenir. The experience with Diggers was fascinating. There was a whole past life of the house, sitting buried just a few inches under the grass. The 2 guys from the show said their metal detectors indicated we probably had 10 times as much as they actually dug up. So they encouraged us to do some more digging on our own. But of course, there are other ways to dig that don't involve a metal detector and a shovel. These are just a few of the more obvious ones, and not surprisingly, I use them all. But here in the Cape, we've got extra resources of our own. The first one is the Sturgis Library, which has some amazing historical collections, plus some very helpful people. The library archives include rows and rows of one-of-a-kind books and photo collections, all waiting to open up their secrets. Then there's the Barnstable Patriot, a weekly paper that goes all the way back to 1830. Here's a view of the Patriot's old building in the 1870s. Founder Sylvanus Finney is the man leaning against the pole out front. One thing that makes the Patriot such a terrific resource is that all 185 years of it are available online. You can actually see every page of every issue and even search them electronically. And there's also Tales of Cape Cod, a local organization dedicated to Cape history and housed in the old courthouse. It has a somewhat hit-or-miss collection, but with some fascinating pieces. It started back in 1949, when Lou Cataldo assembled some recording equipment and used it to capture the voices and stories of old Cape Codders. The result today is hundreds of oral histories available either at the Sturgis Library or at Cape Cod Community College in West Barnstable. I was on the board of Tales of Cape Cod for 9 years, and my parting gift when my term was up was to put together a photo exhibit that's been in the boardroom, the former church parish hall, ever since. This is one of my favorite pictures from that show, a group of people walking across Barnstable Harbor from Sandy Neck to Scudder Lane. You'd think we had a tough winter last year. In 1910, when this picture was taken, the harbor was already frozen solid in December. Here's a somewhat more cheerful scene shot at Sandy Neck on a summer afternoon in 1907. I don't know what she's drinking, but there appears to be plenty for everyone. And here's a lovely scene looking right up Rendezvous Lane at a group of people who've stopped to chat on a summer's day. The photos document many long-gone local events. Here's the cast of The Mikado, as seen in 1902 at a performance staged to raise funds for a new village hall. The hall finally opened its doors in 1912 and is now the home of the Barnstable Comedy Club. And here's a smaller group of performers, as shown in a blue cyanotype print. Cyanotype printing was used for generations in engineers' blueprints, but also in some late 19th century photos. And among those boxes in the Sturgis Library, there's a large portfolio of cyanotypes left by Judy Barnett, who lived next door. The photos were taken in 1888 and 1890 by a young engineer named Weston Radford Bascom, who had just graduated from Washington University in St. Louis and come to the Cape to visit his cousins, bringing his camera with him. One of those cousins was the young woman with the banjo, Mary Kearney Cobb, who lived in a house that later became Judy Barnett's and is now home to my neighbors, Dave and Diane Munsell. Here's another group posing in front of the Globe Hotel, which stood on the site of today's Barnstable Tavern. If you find yourself drawn to the guy with the pith helmet, it gets better. Here he is, sitting on the steps with a bunch of other guests and possibly some staff. I love the beard on the guy behind him. It looks windblown, though there's no other indication that the wind was actually blowing. I also like the woman with the very attentive dog and the boy with his rather floppy tennis racket. Looking at the stars and stripes in the kids' outfits, I'm guessing this might have been taken somewhere around July 4th. Anyways, I'm sitting in the library looking through the box of photos. I get to this one, strongly reminiscent of the photo that came with our house, and in fact clearly of our house. Only in this case, there are lots of people in it, including someone looking down from the upstairs window. And then I turn to the next photo, and here they are. A whole group of 15 people, representing at least 3 generations, including the man with the white beard, and presumably his wife next to him, all sitting on the front steps of my house in 1888. With all these people looking out at me, I decided it was time to get serious with my investigation. And what I found was a family that occupied the house for more than 3 times as long as Henry Crocker and lived through some notable events, not just here in Barnstable, but on a much bigger stage. So who was this man who sat there in 1888 commanding the scene like an old sea captain? Turns out he was a sea captain. And yes, by the way, also the grandfather of the man who stopped by my house that day in 2005. His name was William Radford, and he was a rear admiral in the U.S. Navy. He had served the Navy all over the world, from his teenage days as a midshipman on old Ironsides to commanding the new Ironsides for the Union Navy in the Civil War. And that's just the beginning of the story. Actually, it's not the beginning. Let's go back to the beginning. William Radford was born in Virginia in 1809, the same year as Lincoln. When he was 8 years old, his father was killed in a hunting accident involving a wild boar. His mother, Harriet, faced with raising 3 small children on her own, moved the family to Missouri to be close to her brothers and her cousin Julia. And as it happened, Julia was married to General William Clark, governor of the Missouri Territory and famous for his role in the Lewis and Clark expedition. 3 years later, cousin Julia fell ill and died, and a year after that, in keeping with Julia's dying wishes, General Clark married Harriet. But young William, age 12, having settled in with his uncles, refused to move into his stepfather's house. And after a brief standoff, they sent him off to boarding school in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, just off New York Harbor. And it was there that he discovered and fell in love with the sea. His relationship with his stepfather gradually improved, and they eventually became quite close. And so it was that at age 15, he asked him for a recommendation to the U.S. Navy. This proved to be an excellent idea, as General Clark was happy to make a personal request to his friend President John Quincy Adams. So on March 1st, 1825, his 16th birthday, at President Adams' direction, William Radford was admitted into the Navy as a midshipman. And in August, for his first tour of sea duty, he received a plum assignment to the hand-picked crew of the USS Brandywine, which was bringing the Marquis de Lafayette, a famous hero of the American Revolution, back to France following his triumphant return visit to the United States. Also traveling with Lafayette was his son, George Washington Lafayette, whose name was an emblem of the close relationship the two leaders had formed. And by the way, another midshipman on the crew was David Farragut, later to become one of the most famous figures in U.S. Navy history. Meanwhile, as William Radford was embarking on a naval career, another young man from Missouri, named Stephen Kearney, was rising fast in the U.S. Army, en route to becoming a founding officer of the United States Cavalry, commanding general of the Army of the West in the war with Mexico, and later on military governor of California. Radford and Kearney soon crossed paths as Kearney began courting William's sister Mary, a union which would ultimately produce 10 children and bring the two families together for generations to come. Radford's next 20 years took him all over the world, from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean to the Pacific. While in the Pacific, he served all the way from the icebound shores of North and South America to the tropical waters of Tahiti and Bora Bora. A tour which had its rigors, but also its compensations. Then he came home and got married. These photos show William Radford and his wife Mary Lovell somewhere about the time of their wedding in 1848, although they don't present a picture of complete wedded bliss. One reason for that may have been that Radford spent most of the next 12 years on shore duty, including 3 years at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. However nice for the family, it was inevitably frustrating for a seagoing man, even though he continued to advance in rank. In 1860, he finally got a ship of his own, the Dakota, and took it all the way to Hong Kong, only to be recalled after the start of the Civil War, when all officers who had originally come from slave states were required to submit to a security evaluation before being declared fit for command of a Union vessel. But that was nothing compared to the frustrations of 1862. On February 8th, he was given command of the Cumberland, but was serving on a Naval Board of Inquiry at the time and was delayed in reaching his ship. And on March 8th, just as he was getting there, it was sunk by the Confederate ram Virginia during the Battle of Hampton Roads. The Virginia was the ship formerly known as the Merrimac, a Union ship that had been sunk to avoid capture, then salvaged by the Confederacy and refitted as an ironclad. You can see it here, facing off against the Union ironclad Monitor as the Cumberland burns to the waterline and the crew swim for their lives. From that disastrous scene, for William Radford, it was back to shore duty as executive officer of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, as the Navy sought frantically to outfit hundreds of new Union vessels. Ironclads were an increasing part of this new generation of Navy warships. Here they are lined up for the attack on Charleston in 1863. Commodore Radford finally got his reward in 1864 when he was put in command of the ironclad division of Admiral Porter's squadron, the largest naval task force of the war. Led by Radford's ship, the New Ironsides, the division was a key contributor to the Union victory at Fort Fisher that helped seal the fate of the Confederacy at the beginning of 1865. For their performance, Radford received official commendation, and 8 members of his crew received medals of honor. These photos show how Radford's appearance evolved during the war, the first from 1860 and the other from 1863. Whatever the benefits of his new facial hair, it could not conceal a growing degree of war weariness. However, the war finally ended in the spring of 1865, with both sides apparently agreeing that the increase in facial hair lent extra dignity to the occasion. And a few weeks later, Radford was promoted to acting rear admiral in command of the Navy's North Atlantic Squadron. Here's a painting of his flagship, the Malvern, which shows how technology was continuing to change the ways the Navy took to sea. Then in 1869, he took his family with him to Lisbon to take charge of the Navy's European operations and sent his children off to schools in Lausanne, Switzerland. Here are 2 views of him at this time, settled into his new role and well on his way to becoming a white-bearded man in those old photos. Yet even that assignment proved fairly short-lived. In 1870, France and Germany went to war, and just a few months later, concerned for his family's safety, Radford pulled his children out of their Swiss schools, stepped down from his post, and brought his family home on a commercial ship to avoid capture by the advancing Prussian army. Back in Washington, they eased into retirement by building this imposing house on N Street to be their home during the winter, and began laying plans to come to the Cape to avoid the heat of the Washington summer. After several years of visiting and renting, in 1882, they bought the old Henry Crocker house and summered here regularly through the rest of the Admiral's life. In addition to its comfortable size and pleasant setting, the house may well have appealed to them for its history as a sanctuary for victims of slavery seeking freedom via the Underground Railroad. Meanwhile, for my part, with all this history now in hand, I decided it was time to have another conversation with Bill Coyle. Bill's a retired pediatrician who lives in Florida, but he still comes up here periodically, and he remembers the house well. Turns out he also has his own stash of memorabilia, including this same photo with a key. The Admiral and his wife had 7 children and 8 grandchildren, and there were also lots of cousins through his sister's marriage to Stephen Kearney. One of them was Mary Kearney Cobb, here standing behind the Admiral, sans banjo. Another was the photographer Radford Bascom, son of the Kearney's daughter Ellen. He too became a regular at the Cape, and he also had a long career as a New York City engineer, including a leading role in the construction of the Williamsburg Bridge. In this photo, the Admiral's son-in-law, Randolph Coyle, who was Assistant District Attorney for Washington, D.C., seems a bit disengaged from the others, nursing a drink while reading the paper, as his wife Mary sits primly by his side. But their kids look very chipper, especially Alice and Edith, who, unlike Mary Kearney on the lower left, seem quite happy to be there. Like many in the family, they were headed for interesting lives of their own. Alice grew into a writer, producer of amateur theatricals, and mother of a long-time career diplomat of the Cold War era. Edith went on to a life of outdoor adventure, with her husband, a pioneering geologist of the far west. Here are Edith and her husband on their honeymoon in 1911. Francois Mattes was a Frenchman who settled in the U.S. and spent years mapping large areas of the Pacific Northwest. Edith shared his love of science, having worked at the Smithsonian. She also spoke 4 languages and had lived a very cosmopolitan life in Washington and Europe. But with her marriage, she began a very different life, leaving right after their wedding to go camp out on Mount Rainier. She learned to ride horses and climb mountains, and she sat for hours taking down angles and working out elevations. For years they traveled together, with Edith managing supplies and serving as driver on roads that often ended in the middle of nowhere. When that happened, she would lock herself in the car till he returned at the end of the day, with her weapon of defense on the seat beside her, a geologist's pick. Here they are in more congenial terrain, riding through Yosemite. Several features in today's Yosemite and Grand Canyon National Parks are named for him, though apparently none for her. Seeing Edith in this setting, I can't help wondering how she must have felt comparing her experience with that of her grandfather's stepfather, William Clark, as he worked his way west with Meriwether Lewis a century earlier. Here's one more shot of Edith leading the flag bearers at a 4th of July parade in Yosemite. Now a word or two about the youngest people in the picture. At the bottom of the photo, sitting on his mother's lap, is Robert Radford, born in January of that year. Known as Robin as a child, he grew up to become a soldier engineer with a long career. He served the Army in both World Wars, ending World War I as a captain and World War II as a colonel. After the war, he served in Greece as lead engineer for the U.S. mission in conjunction with the Marshall Plan, an effort disastrously complicated by the onset of the Greek Civil War. Radford died in Athens in 1948 and was brought home to Arlington National Cemetery, where one of the pallbearers was his cousin, Marine Corps Colonel Randolph Coyle III, the little boy in white at the far left of that 1888 photo. Robert Radford also had a daughter who went on to a distinguished career of her own and is still alive and well today at 79. Rosemary Radford Ruther has an international following as a teacher and author in the field of feminist theology. She's written nearly 50 books that I'd never heard of until this past year, but I've read 2 of them, and they're both terrific, which is just one way of demonstrating how far afield a project like this can take you once you get going. Finally, to 2 people who should have been in that photo but weren't, one of whom is the real star of my story. But first, about the boy in this picture, shown here in 1884. He's William Radford Coyle, the only child of Randolph and Mary Coyle who somehow escaped that 1888 photo shoot. Here he is next to his sister Edith, the future geologist. And here he is again on the left in 1925, a U.S. congressman from Pennsylvania, about to take off in a 2-seater airplane. It was Congressman Coyle whose purchase of the house in 1924 brought it back into the family 22 years after his grandmother sold it and 34 years after the Admiral died in 1890. So he was not only a grandson of Admiral Radford, but also Bill Coyle's grandfather, which makes him the missing link in that chain of ownership. But whatever his own personal merits, his story is nothing compared to that of another family member who was also missing from that 1888 photo. His Aunt Sophie, the Admiral's second daughter, who was born in 1854 and died in 1957. She had a truly amazing life. Here she is in 1863 as a child of 9, along with her older sister Mary and 2 of her younger brothers. They look remarkably composed for children of a military man in the midst of the Civil War. And in fact, they had a pretty privileged upbringing, both during the war and afterwards. In between her father's assignments overseas, Sophie was at the heart of Washington's post-Civil War social whirl during her teenage years. She led a life of parties, debutante balls, and fancy schools. She was smart, lively, and carefree. But on Washington's birthday in 1877, she went out riding in Rock Creek Park with her friends and had an accident that changed her life forever. It was a beautiful day for a ride, but suddenly something startled her horse, the horse threw her, and in falling she hit her head on a rock and cracked her skull. She was taken to a hospital and lay in a coma for more than a month. But gradually she recovered, and during her convalescence she was visited faithfully by a young man named Valdemar de Meissner, who had recently taken a position as secretary to the Russian Imperial Legation in Washington. A year and a half later, she celebrated her 24th birthday by marrying him at the just completed Church of the Ascension right around the corner from her family's new house. This was a huge event in Washington society. The Washington Post devoted 2 feature articles to the wedding preparations. The clip on the left is just the tip of the iceberg. The full article is nearly 10 times as long. The glitterati of the day were all there, and among the guests, President and Mrs. Rutherford B. Hayes and General William Tecumseh Sherman. Following the wedding, the couple left the comforts of Washington and set sail for Europe, as Valdemar embarked on a career of diplomatic service to Imperial Russia under Tsar Alexander II. For the daughter of an American naval officer who had risen to fame in the war against slavery, it's possible that the Tsar represented a kind of father figure as well for Sophie, as he presided over the emancipation of millions of serfs in 1861. In any case, it must have been exciting to go from the United States to Russia at a time when these 2 vast countries once again seemed to be moving on parallel paths, as they had famously appeared to Alexis de Tocqueville a generation earlier. Yet along with its opportunities, Russia presented immense challenges. Over the years, Tsar Alexander was the target of repeated attempts on his life, and he was finally assassinated in 1881, less than 2.5 years after Sophie and Valdemar had entered his service. But in that time, the couple had ranged far and wide on his behalf and made valuable friendships in the imperial court, including his son, Alexander III, and his wife, Maria Feodorovna. Their first posting was to Bern, Switzerland, but they inevitably spent a lot of time in St. Petersburg. And it was here that Sophie became fluent in Russian, along with the English, French, and German that she already knew. This view from the 1880s shows her in transition from diplomat's bride to young matron. Soon Sophie and Valdemar had a son, Sasha, who was named Alexander in honor of the Tsar. It was during this period that she first tried her hand at writing, at first with mixed results, but later, better. These 2 stories were both published in Scribner's magazine. But tumultuous events once again changed her life. In 1890, her father died. 1894 saw the death of Tsar Alexander III. But the worst was yet to come. In 1896, with Valdemar stationed in Lisbon, where this scene comes from, Sophie took a trip to Russia to visit Sasha at his military school. And while she was away, Valdemar caught pneumonia and died. Here's the notice in the Barnstable Patriot. This was a crushing blow to Sophie, and soon afterwards she left Lisbon and moved back to St. Petersburg to be close to Sasha. To make that possible, she accepted a position as lady-in-waiting to the Tsar's widow, the Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna, for whom the untimely loss of her husband was part and parcel of the greater misfortune of having left her promising life as a Danish princess and married into the ill-fated Romanov clan. But that's another story. From her position in the imperial court, Sophie poured her energies into her son's career. She set great store by Sasha's 1898 appointment to a regiment of the Imperial Dragoons and his status as a godson of Alexander III. But Sasha too fell ill and died of a throat infection in August 1899, just short of his 21st birthday. And with that, Sophie headed home to her mother's house in Washington, D.C., widowed and childless at 45, unaware that she had another 57 years to live. However, once there, she revived and soon plunged into life with renewed vigor, lecturing and mounting exhibits based on her Russian experiences and the thousands of memorabilia she'd brought home. She also resumed her writing, completing 2 novels and translating a pair of Russian plays into English for American audiences. She then took one of them, The Death of Ivan the Terrible by Alexei Tolstoy, and saw it through to a successful production on Broadway in 1904, with the famous Shakespearean actor Richard Mansfield in the title role. Then in 1905, she dropped everything in response to a plea from her old patroness Maria Fyodorovna and rushed back to St. Petersburg, bringing her niece Edith Coyle with her, and served for 2 years as a Red Cross nurse, tending to soldiers wounded during the Russo-Japanese War. But for all this busyness, Sophie remained deeply troubled about the loss of her husband and son, until one day she experienced something miraculous. She started hearing their voices from beyond the grave. Spiritualism was in full flower at the time. Many intellectuals were fascinated by the phenomenon of automatic writing based on spirit dictation. The background on this slide shows a particularly elegant sample of automatic writing. Gorgeous calligraphy, but not very easy to decipher. But when Sophie started hearing from her husband, she was more than receptive. She was absolutely confident that she was recording his messages faithfully, not to mention those of their son. This went on for more than a dozen years, during which time Sophie and others were quite public about their experiences. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was also a believer, though interestingly, Sherlock Holmes was not. Presented with supernatural phenomena in one case, he remarked rather acidly, "The world is big enough for us. No ghosts need apply." Following the sinking of the Titanic in April 1912, it seemed the ether was thick with the voices of people who had gone down on the ship. Sophie reported hearing from Titanic passenger Ida Strauss, as well as Captain Smith himself. She also received messages from Army Major Archibald Butt, Chief Military Aide to President Taft. In the larger photo, Major Butt is in uniform on the left. President Taft appears in the fullness of command, flanked by British General Robert Baden-Powell, most famous as the founder of the Boy Scouts, and Lord Bryce, the British ambassador. Sophie was out shopping when she first heard from Major Butt, whom, by the way, she had never met before. She calmly told him to call her later, which he did that evening. Major Butt assured Sophie he was just fine after the initial trauma of the sinking. He then asked her to convey this information to President Taft, as it might help to console him in this difficult time. And Sophie, being undaunted and well-connected, soon did so in person. Naturally, the newspapers had a field day, and Sophie wrote another book, which you can still buy on Amazon. She also kept up a voluminous correspondence with a living. Her letters from friends in Europe gave U.S. readers a window into the unfolding disaster of the First World War. In 1918, a year after the U.S. entry into the war, the Navy launched a new destroyer named for her father. Inspired by this, Sophie wrote her longest book, Old Naval Days, a pleasantly gossipy 400-page tribute to her father's life and career. My slides of her father's ships came from this book. Even more interesting to me was the last chapter, which focused on the Admiral's retirement and life in Barnstable. It also includes the full text of his 1890 obituary in the Cape Cod item, part of which you can see in the lower half of the slide. The Radfords were usually only here from May to October, but they were active in the community. The Admiral was the first treasurer of St. Mary's Church, and before the church itself was built, services were often held in the front parlor of the house. Not surprisingly, many in the family were avid sailors and participants in local races. The Admiral's son Carlton and his cousin Radford Bascom, the photographer, were also frequently to be found in a cast of local theater productions, such as the Gilbert and Sullivan Mikado in the earlier slide. Sophie spent the summer here in 1886, From then on, her husband's career kept her from returning until after her father died. But she was a regular summer presence from the 1890s through the first half of the 20th century. She also kept up with her writing. Rachel Ogden is the story of an ancestor who picked the wrong side in the American Revolution and spent 10 years in exile in Nova Scotia. She also wrote an autobiography, which might have been a great help in preparing this presentation had I been able to find it. And she continued to pass on letters from friends in Europe as they faced the gathering storm that would lead to the Second World War. Then in 1942, with the United States again at war, and the original destroyer Radford having been decommissioned in the 30s, the Navy launched a new ship named for the admiral. The new Radford, DD-446, served throughout the war in the Pacific and continued its service until 1968, when it was retired to Honolulu, where the color photo was taken. With the launch of the new Radford, Sophie experienced a fresh round of patriotic fervor, but by this time she was done writing books. Instead, she told her nieces and nephews she wanted to put her money into war bonds. They said, "Sophie, you're crazy. You're almost 90. Think short maturities, please." But she went ahead, taking great delight in buying 10-year bonds and then cashing them in on the eve of her 100th birthday. But by this time, she was well into her declining years. A broken hip left her confined to a wheelchair at the Washington, D.C. Home for the Incurables, an institution that still exists today under the somewhat friendlier name of the Washington Home and Community Hospices. It's interesting that her obituary in the New York Times focused most on her translation of the Tolstoy play, while skipping over the fact that it was a different Tolstoy from the one who wrote War and Peace. My neighbor Sally Reeder told me she remembers Sophie as an old lady during her childhood, to which I responded, well, Sophie was an old lady for a very long time. So having uncovered this far-flung history of the people in the house that bears Henry Crocker's name, what better way to close the loop than with a visit last spring from Bill Coyle's son Jim and granddaughter Cersei. Jim is the one taking this photo. You can just see his reflection hovering over this enlarged view of the family in 1888. Cersei is the one on the right, great-great-great-great-granddaughter of Admiral and Mrs. Radford. But what of Henry Crocker? He may have abandoned ship in Barnstable, but he wasn't a bad guy. His ambitions just took him out of town. He was a state rep for 6 years in the 1830s, as well as Barnstable town moderator in 1838. In 1839, he was chairman of the town's bicentennial observance. And in 1851, he was a founding board member of the Cape Cod Association, which still operates today under the wing of the Cape Cod Foundation, providing scholarships to local students. He also had a lot of success in Boston. He spent a year as sheriff of Suffolk County, several years as chief appraiser for U.S. Customs in the Port of Boston, and 14 years as president of Union Mutual Life Insurance Company. Thanks to Unum Corp for this portrait of its long-ago CEO. So Henry may well deserve his place on that plaque. But my question to you is, who are the Henrys, or the William or Sophie Radfords, or the Edith Coyles or Mary Cobbs in your house? If you look hard enough, with the help of the incredible resources available today, chances are you can not only find them, but get to know them. And maybe to some degree, to borrow a notion from Sophie, even bring them back to life. Thank you. And thanks to all these people too.